The Blackwood estate rose from the lowlands like a monument carved from arrogance. Its columns gleamed white in the Georgia sun, their shine masking the rot within. The fields stretched in every direction, endless waves of cotton that shimmered when the wind moved across them. But behind their beauty was the sound of groans and the crack of the overseer's whip. The mansion was spoken of with envy in Savannah, its parlors filled with imported carpets, its tables laden with silver, its cellars stocked with wine. Guests marveled at its grandeur, never asking what blood soaked its soil, never wondering how many backs had bent to build its splendor. Rita moved in that world as if invisible. She was born on that very land, though her mother had been dragged there from another county after a sale that severed her from all she had known. Rita's earliest memories were of smoke rising from chimneys, the taste of cornbread rationed in pieces too small to fill a child's stomach, and the endless labor that shaped every breath of her life. She learned to carry water before she was tall enough to balance the bucket, learned to keep her head lowered when the master walked by, learned that silence was not a choice but a shield. The Blackwood family lived as if their wealth was proof of divine blessing. James Blackwood, the master, carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he owned not only the land, but the very air above it. His voice thundered across the fields, his commands carried out with a cruelty sharpened by pride. Caroline, his wife, wrapped her ruthlessness in prayer, speaking of scripture while demanding punishment for the smallest offense. Their children grew up as mirrors of their parents, quick to strike, quicker to sneer. To them, the enslaved were not human beings but extensions of their will, bodies to be used, broken, replaced. Rita watched all of it. She saw the guests who came in carriages, dressed in silks and polished boots, laughing as they toasted to prosperity. She saw the men who rode the grounds at night, pistols at their sides, their eyes searching for any sign of rebellion. She saw the women of the household, their hands soft and unmarked, their complaints sharp and constant, while the enslaved bent beneath baskets so heavy they left welts across their shoulders. Rita did not speak of what she saw. She carried it inside her, each detail a stone added to the weight she bore. The days followed one another with crushing sameness. Dawn broke with the sound of the horn, and the fields filled with bent bodies. Heat pressed down, insects bit, sweat ran into eyes that had no chance to rest. Night brought little relief, for there were chores still to finish, and the quarters were crowded, the air thick with the smell of too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Yet even in the smallest corners of despair, there were sparks of life. Songs hummed low after dark, a shared meal of scraps passed hand to hand, a story told to children who deserved to dream of more than toil. Rita's strength was in her quiet. While others found small release in laughter or whispers, she listened. She memorized faces, remembered slights, counted every cruelty. She never forgot the sound of lashes on her mother's back, nor the way her brother was sold away before he had reached his 10th year. She carried those memories not as wounds, but as fuel. She knew the plantation's rhythms better than anyone. She knew which doors creaked, which floors sagged, which nights the master drank himself into rage and which into stupor. She held all of it inside, waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. The land itself seemed heavy with secrets. Cypress trees stood along the riverbank, their roots half buried in mud that swallowed whatever fell into it. The air was thick with the perfume of magnolia, sweet enough to make one forget the stench of blood and sweat. At night, the whippoorwills called from the trees, their cries mixing with the distant sound of chains rattling when a restless sleeper turned on a pallet. The plantation lived in two worlds, one of wealth and display, another of misery and silence. Rita moved between them, always present, never acknowledged. Guests praised James Blackwood for his management, for the way his cotton yields outpaced his neighbors, for the discipline of his labor force. They never saw the scars hidden under cloth, never cared to notice the hollow look in eyes forced to labor past exhaustion. They dined on food prepared by hands that trembled from fatigue, drank from cups polished by women who would never taste the wine. Their conversations turned on politics and profits, blind to the truth around them. Rita passed among them unnoticed, her presence accepted but unseen, as if she were part of the furniture rather than a living soul. In the quarters, the elders whispered of justice. They spoke of storms that might sweep away the masters, of fires that could cleanse the land, of rivers that carried away pain. Rita listened, her face still, her thoughts gathering. She had no visions of storms or fire. She had something else, a patience that ran deeper than the river, a silence sharp as a blade. The Blackwood estate stood tall, its pride untouched, its wealth unshaken. But in the shadows of its columns and in the quiet of its kitchens, Rita's eyes missed nothing. The Blackwood plantation was a world built on suffering disguised as order, a world that seemed unshakable. Yet beneath its surface, in the silence of a woman who spoke little and watched much, something had begun to form. Not hope, not yet. Something heavier, something sharper. It was not seen, not heard, but it was there all the same, waiting for the moment when the weight of silence would become too much to bear. The days on the Blackwood estate blended together, each one marked by the same horn at dawn, the same cries in the fields, the same prayers whispered at night that never seemed to rise past the rafters. Work began before the sun warmed the ground and did not end until the stars were high. Men and women stooped low in the rows, fingers raw from plucking cotton until blood spotted the white bowls. Children carried water, their small arms trembling under the weight of buckets. The overseer's horse paced along the lines, his eyes sharp, his whip quicker than words. Every sound carried, the thud of a hoe, the rustle of leaves, the hiss of lashes, the muffled groans of those struck down. In the great house, life moved at another pace entirely. Caroline Blackwood read from her Bible, her voice lilting with the certainty of a woman who believed her cruelty was sanctified. She spoke of order, of divine duty, of the righteousness of discipline. Yet when she ordered a young girl whipped for dropping a plate, there was no scripture read, only the thud of leather on flesh. James Blackwood strutted through the halls with his boots polished, his voice booming as he told guests of his profits and his skill. To him, suffering was proof of success, misery the measure of his wealth. Their children learned early to command, to sneer, to treat the enslaved as nothing more than shadows moving at their bidding. Rita bore witness to it all. She carried water to the parlor when Caroline prayed aloud, her face blank though her ears caught every word. She polished James's boots until her hands ached, her gaze lowered so as not to invite his scorn. She helped set the children's table, her movements precise, knowing that any misstep would mean another lash. Yet even as she bowed her head, she noticed everything. The way James's hand lingered too long on the wine jug, the way Caroline's lips tightened when her husband spoke too freely of business, the way the children's cruelty sharpened when no one checked them. She saw the cracks in the walls that others ignored. At night in the quarters, the air was thick with the weight of exhaustion. Bodies pressed together for warmth, the floor hard beneath them, voices hushed though no master listened. Some sang to chase away despair, their songs carried low and steady, words that rose from ancestors carried across oceans. Others sat silent, staring into the dark, their eyes open long after their bodies stilled. Rita often stayed quiet, her thoughts heavy. She listened to the stories the elders told, of days before capture, of rivers wider than any in Georgia, of skies free of chains. The children listened with wide eyes, their imaginations catching glimpses of a world beyond cotton rows. Rita listened too, but what she heard was not only memory, it was longing sharpened by years of cruelty. Her silence became her armor. The masters saw only a woman obedient, steady, without complaint. They mistook her stillness for submission, her quiet for emptiness. But silence can hold more than words. Within it grew memories of every lash, every sail, every face lost to the trader's block. It grew heavy with secrets, with the knowledge of how the household moved, with the understanding of each habit, each weakness. Rita spoke little, but she remembered everything, and in remembering she carried a weight that the masters could not see, but that pressed on her with each passing year. There were moments when the weight almost crushed her. Watching a boy her brother's age dragged screaming from the quarters, never to return. Hearing her mother's breath break under the whip while Caroline hummed a hymn. Standing at the kitchen hearth while James ranted about discipline, his voice thick with drink. Each moment pressed down like another stone laid upon her back. She felt herself sinking, and yet she did not break. She carried the weight because she had no other choice, and with each day her silence grew denser, harder, like iron hidden beneath cloth. The plantation thrived on that silence. It depended on voices swallowed, on cries muffled, on truths never spoken. Guests arrived and saw nothing but order, never hearing the quiet rage carried in the hearts of those who served them. James boasted of harmony, of loyalty, of his mastery over those bound to him. Caroline nodded in agreement, her lips pursed in piety. But the silence was not empty. It was crowded with everything unspoken, and it pressed closer with each season. Rita understood this better than anyone. She moved through the house as if part of its walls, but inside her the weight grew until she wondered how much longer she could bear it. She never let it show. Her face stayed smooth, her hands steady, her steps measured. Yet her silence was not surrender. It was storage, it was waiting, it was the gathering of strength in the shadows. She did not yet know what it would mean or when it would break, but she felt it there, alive beneath her skin. The world outside the estate carried on, but within its borders, time seemed frozen. Cotton grew, children aged, new faces were brought in and old ones taken away, but the pattern never changed. The Blackwoods believed it never would. They believed the weight of silence would hold forever. Rita knew better. She felt it pressing against her bones, and she knew that nothing so heavy could last without finally cracking. The nights were the only hours that belonged to Rita, and even those were borrowed. By day, she bent her back to tasks chosen by others, her hands blistered from scrubbing floors, carrying water, or polishing brass until it gleamed enough for Caroline's cold approval. But when darkness came and the household lay heavy with drink and exhaustion, she claimed a sliver of freedom in secret. Beneath the floorboard in the corner of the quarters, where the wood bent slightly but did not creak if stepped on carefully, she kept her most dangerous possession. Not a knife or a key or a stolen coin, though those might have carried her far, but something heavier in the long run. Words. The journal was nothing more than loose sheets bound with twine, stolen one by one from the edges of ledgers, account books, and shipping receipts she was forced to handle. She slipped them away in pockets when no one watched, smoothing them flat at night and stacking them like treasure. Ink was harder to come by, so she made her own from ash and vinegar, its scent sharp in the still air. The quill she fashioned from a chicken feather trimmed with care. What she wrote with these crude tools was nothing less than a record of truth that no plantation ledger would ever hold. Every entry bore witness. She wrote names, dates, and deeds that others prayed to forget. She recorded the deaths explained away as accidents, the whippings that drew blood from bone, the children sold under the guise of debts repaid. She wrote about the cries in the night that were silenced by threats, about women forced to smile while carrying pain too heavy to name. She wrote it all down in a steady hand, her letters sharp and sure, her sentences plain and stripped of ornament. There was no need for flourish. The horror spoke for itself. Her writing was dangerous not only because it preserved memory, but because it proved possibility. The very act of shaping words forbidden to her was an act of rebellion. The Blackwoods had built their world on the belief that the enslaved could not think beyond the field, could not see beyond the whip. Rita's writing shattered that illusion line by line. It said, "I see you. I remember. You cannot bury everything." At first, the journal was only for her, a way to hold what her silence could not contain. But over time, it became something larger, a shield against despair. When she wrote, she felt less alone, as if the page itself carried her burden. Each sentence was a defiance of forgetting, a small strike against the erasure the Blackwoods demanded. She did not share it, not even with those she trusted most. To reveal it would be to endanger them all. The floorboard hid it, but the knowledge of it pulsed inside her, a secret heartbeat that kept her moving through the endless days. Her entries grew more precise as she listened more carefully. She memorized conversations when she served at the table, committing to memory every careless boast and whispered plan. She noted the way Samuel kept 2 ledgers, one for neighbors and one locked in his desk, the second thick with figures that betrayed the true cost of his wealth. She recorded Jacob's experiments on the sick, his muttered notes about endurance and thresholds that reduced people to subjects. She detailed the nights when Thomas prowled through the quarters, choosing without explanation, leaving behind silence that bled into mourning. The journal was not only a record of cruelty. It also captured small flashes of resistance, though they were often swallowed before they could bloom. A man slipping extra food to a child though he knew it might earn him lashes. A woman humming an old tune under her breath when ordered to sing a hymn. 2 young boys who carved their names into the underside of a workbench, proof that they existed even if sold tomorrow. Rita wrote these moments down with the same care as she did the cruelties, for they, too, mattered. They proved that even within chains, the spirit did not fully break. Her greatest fear was not discovery of the journal, but destruction of it. Fire haunted her thoughts. One stray spark from the hearth, one sudden search, and everything she had preserved would vanish in smoke. Sometimes she dreamed of hiding it deeper, carrying it into the swamps, burying it in jars like roots. But she always returned it to the floorboard, close enough to reach yet hidden from sight. The danger of keeping it near was balanced by the terror of losing it. What she did not know was whether her words would ever be read by another. Some nights she wrote as if to a future that might never come, as if speaking across time to eyes not yet born. Other nights she wrote only for herself, to steady her own heart against the weight of what she had seen. The pages filled with testimony that no court would hear and no church would honor, yet she believed they mattered. Even if she died tomorrow, the record would remain, and in that survival there was a kind of victory. The longer she wrote, the clearer her vision became. She began to see not only the cruelty of the brothers, but the structure that supported them. The judge who signed papers without looking. The doctor who claimed death where there had been murder. The traders who asked no questions so long as coin exchanged hands. She began to understand that the Blackwoods were not isolated monsters, but links in a chain that stretched far beyond their land. She saw that her story was not only hers but the story of many, repeated across fields and counties, hidden by silence. Each word she pressed into the page deepened her conviction that silence was no longer enough. The journal became both mirror and map, reflecting the horrors she endured while pointing toward something she could not yet name. It was not yet a plan, but it was a beginning. The summer of 1836 came heavy with heat that pressed down like a hand on the land. Days began before dawn, and the air never cooled enough to ease the lungs. Cicadas screamed in the trees, their endless drone echoing the weight that sat on every back. The river slowed, its water low and sluggish, while the earth cracked beneath the sun. People toiled harder, though strength gave way faster in such heat, and every mistake was punished as if the weather itself were a rebellion. Rita moved through these days with care, her steps steady and her face unreadable. She carried water to the house, scrubbed linen until her fingers bled, and kept her eyes lowered when called upon. To anyone watching, she was as she had always been, silent and obedient. But inside, something was shifting. The journal beneath the floorboard had grown thick, its pages heavy with testimony. Each word written there had sharpened her sense of what she faced and what might be required to end it. Silence could not last forever. The brothers grew more reckless with the heat, their tempers flaring like dry tinder. Samuel cursed at workers until his throat grew hoarse, beating men for failing to lift loads even he could not have carried. Thomas stalked the nights, drunk on whiskey, his anger spilling over into the quarters. Jacob experimented more brazenly, pressing his hands against fevers and muttering notes about how long a body could endure hunger before collapse. Caroline kept her distance, but her approval was marked in silence. No hand of hers ever stopped them, and her stillness was as cruel as their blows. Talk spread quietly among the enslaved, passed in whispers when no ear but trusted ones could hear. Men bent low in the field spoke of patterns they had noticed. How Samuel borrowed more money than he claimed, how wagons carried crates not listed in the ledgers, how neighbors came and went at night. Women spoke of the children taken with little warning, sold not for debt but for profit hidden in false accounts. The truth of the family's dealings lay bare for anyone who dared connect the threads. Rita connected more than most, her mind weaving what her eyes and ears gathered into a picture both terrible and precise. Her journal had become more than record now. It was a guide to the weaknesses of the household. She wrote when Samuel left for meetings and when he returned. She noted how Thomas grew careless with keys when he drank. She observed that Jacob's medicines sat unguarded, powders and liquids capable of harm as much as healing. She saw how Caroline's routines never varied, how she demanded supper at the same hour, how she trusted food only if it came from hands she had known for years. Rita studied it all with a patience that matched her fear. Every detail mattered. She began to test what could be done without notice. A pinch of salt removed from the kitchen without anyone seeing. A spoonful of syrup hidden in a fold of cloth. A cup of water spilled deliberately to mask the absence of something else. No one paid her mind. To them, she was invisible, as predictable as the furniture. That blindness became her shield. But invisibility was not safety. She knew too well that discovery could come at any moment. Once, while returning scraps to the swine, she saw Thomas's eyes linger too long, suspicion flickering behind his drunken gaze. Another time, Caroline asked why her hands were always stained darker than the water she carried. Rita answered with soft words and steady movements, but her heart raced until the questions faded. She knew she could not afford a single mistake. What pressed her forward was not anger alone, though anger was never far. It was the faces she saw each day lined with weariness, bent under loads, beaten into silence. It was the children whose laughter dimmed as soon as footsteps approached. It was the graves dug shallow and quick, covered before dawn erased the evidence. Each day confirmed what her journal had long told her. This life was not meant to be endured without answer. The storm she felt building inside her found echo in the land itself. Thunder rolled distant at night. The air split with lightning that never seemed to cool the earth. The crops suffered and tempers worsened with every failed stalk. Neighbors quarreled, debts deepened, and whispers of unrest moved through the county. Men with guns rode more often, claiming to protect against escape, but their presence only proved the fear that sat in every planter's gut. Rita watched and listened. She measured her own fear against the gathering storm and found them equal. She did not know when or how, but she knew the time was drawing near. The house where laughter and cruelty mingled each night would not stand untouched forever. The food they trusted, the routines they depended on, the blindness they carried like armor, all of it could be turned against them. Her journal's pages held not only memory now, but possibility. She could feel it each time she touched the bundle beneath the floorboard, its weight pressing back against her hand. It was no longer enough to record. Words demanded action, and the storm outside was waiting for a spark to set it loose. The evening began like countless others, though for Rita the air felt sharper, each sound brighter in her ears. The cicadas outside still hummed, the river still moved slow, and the lanterns in the house flickered with their familiar yellow glow. Yet nothing about this night was ordinary. She had prepared every step with a patience that stretched across months, each movement carried out as though she were treading the edge of a blade. To the Blackwoods it was just another supper. To her it was the moment when silence would end. Caroline had demanded a fine spread, though the summer heat made appetites smaller. Rita moved between kitchen and dining room with the practiced rhythm of a shadow, carrying platters of roasted fowl, bowls of beans simmered with pork, bread baked golden and crusted, and wine drawn from the cellar. The table was polished until it caught the light, the silver laid in perfect order. To anyone watching, she was only fulfilling her role, a servant whose hands knew no purpose beyond service. Yet every dish she set down carried more than food. The powders had been measured carefully, their bitterness masked by spice, their sharpness softened in fat and salt. Rita had tested tiny traces days before, blending them in broth and tasting just enough to know how they could be hidden. Her hands never trembled as she stirred the last spoonfuls or brushed glaze across the meat. She worked with the calm of someone who had rehearsed each motion in silence, waiting for the night when it would matter most. The brothers entered with their usual noise. Samuel first, his boots heavy on the wood, his voice already thick with drink. Thomas followed, a grin too wide for the jokes he muttered, his eyes sweeping the room in restless hunger. Jacob came last, carrying notes from his day's observations, muttering about the heat's effect on bodies. Caroline glided in moments later, her face stern but composed, wearing the kind of stillness that passed for grace among them. They gathered, as they always did, without thought to who had made ready the table or how much labor it had cost. Rita poured the wine, filling each cup to its rim, moving in silence as though invisible. They began to eat, knives cutting through meat, voices rising with talk of debts, land, and harvests. Samuel boasted of deals struck, his words slurred with pride. Thomas laughed too loud at his own remarks, reaching often for the bottle. Jacob scribbled notes even as he chewed, crumbs dotting the pages he claimed as science. Caroline kept them in order with sharp looks and the occasional word, ensuring the table did not dissolve into chaos. For Rita, every sound was magnified, the scrape of forks, the clink of glasses, the rhythm of chewing. She felt her own heart beat against her ribs, steady but strong, matching the rhythm of her breath. She moved between them without falter, refilling cups, offering more bread, clearing plates as though nothing in her world had changed. Inside, though, everything had. The lines she had written in her journal now breathed in flesh. What she had recorded in secrecy was unfolding in the open. The first signs were subtle. Samuel's words slowed, his hand gripping the table harder than the bottle. He frowned at nothing, his voice breaking mid-boast. Thomas's laughter grew uneven, turning into coughs he tried to wave away. Jacob's pen slipped across the page, his notes dissolving into a dark smear as his hand trembled. Caroline noticed last, her lips pressing into a thin line as she dabbed her mouth with linen, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. They shifted in their seats, confusion knitting into fear. Samuel cursed under his breath, his pride giving way to panic as his breath shortened. Thomas pushed back his chair with a screech of wood, stumbling as though drunk, though no more wine had touched his lips. Jacob pressed his hand to his chest, his neat hair falling loose as his body betrayed him. Caroline rose, calling for order, but her voice cracked, the command swallowed by the tremor in her limbs. Rita stood still, her face calm, her hands folded before her. She did not gloat or cry out. She simply watched as the balance shifted, as the weight that had crushed so many bent back upon its makers. The room smelled of roasted meat and spilled wine, but beneath it lay the sharpness of sweat and fear. The silver gleamed, the candles burned. Yet the supper table had become a stage for a truth long hidden. The house could no longer consume without consequence. The noise rose, chairs toppling, glasses shattering, voices breaking. Samuel shouted for servants who did not come. Thomas begged for breath he could not catch. Jacob tried to write even as his hand failed him, as though one last note could save him. Caroline clutched at the tablecloth, her composure slipping into silence. The storm Rita had carried within her now roared in the room, filling every corner with the sound of reckoning. She turned away at last, moving through the kitchen into the dark beyond the lamps. The air outside was thick but alive, the cicadas still singing, the trees rustling with a faint wind. Behind her, the house that had stood as monument to cruelty trembled with cries. Before her stretched the night, wide and open, waiting for the steps she would take. The cries from the house echoed into the night, muffled at first, then sharp enough to startle the owls from the trees. Rita did not flinch. She walked with slow steps across the yard, her shadow stretching long in the lantern light, the ground beneath her feet dry and cracked. The quarters stirred as voices rose inside the big house. Faces appeared in doorways, eyes wide in the dark, waiting to see if the noise was another drunken fight or something worse. No one moved until Rita passed among them, her calm silence more telling than any words. She did not call them to follow. She did not need to. The sound from the house told its own story, one they had dreamed of but never dared to believe could happen. Samuel's booming voice had shrunk to broken shouts. Thomas's laughter had curdled into a rasp. Jacob's pen scratched once more before falling quiet. Caroline's steady tones cracked into sharp orders that carried no weight. The family that had ruled through fear now struggled with their own fear, and every person within earshot knew it. Rita stopped at the edge of the yard and turned back. She watched the windows of the big house glow with candlelight, shadows lurching inside. The land that had witnessed so many lashes and burials now bore witness to something else. She felt no joy, only a steady release, as though the air she had carried in her chest for years had finally been let go. She thought of the names written in her journal, those who had suffered unseen. This night was theirs as much as hers. Inside, chaos grew. Servants who had long been silent ran in and out, unsure whether to help or to stand still. No order carried authority. The brothers clutched their stomachs, their hands clawing at the table as though wood could save them. Caroline tried to rise above it, her voice commanding, but the tremor in her words betrayed her. The supper table, once polished for display, had become an altar of undoing. Plates shattered, wine spilled like blood, and the air thickened with the stench of sweat and sickness. Word spread fast beyond the yard. Neighbors who had heard the shouts arrived on horseback, lanterns swinging, pistols at their sides. They expected to find a brawl or an uprising, something they could crush. Instead, they saw the Blackwoods collapsed at their own table, faces pale and bodies trembling. Panic showed in their eyes as they realized this was not a simple fight. They demanded explanations, their voices loud, but no answer made sense. Accusations fell on servants, threats spilled like wine, but none of it stopped what was already set in motion. The doctor was called, his bag clutched tight, his face grim. He pressed his fingers to pulses, listened to labored breaths, and shook his head with each examination. His medicines failed, his powders did nothing, his commands were empty. He muttered about poison, about hands that must have prepared the food. All eyes turned to Rita, but she stood in the shadows, silent, her face calm. To them, she was a figure blurred by fear, a presence that carried no trace of guilt, only stillness. The reckoning was not swift. It stretched through the night, each hour heavier than the last. Samuel raged until his voice broke. Thomas begged until no sound came. Jacob scribbled nonsense until ink stained his skin. Caroline gripped her chair until her fingers bled. They fell one by one, their strength drained, their wealth powerless against what coursed through their veins. The house grew quiet at last, the silence broken only by the creak of wood and the whisper of wind through the shutters. Outside, the enslaved gathered in small clusters, speaking low, unsure of what came next. Fear mingled with wonder, for they knew well how vengeance often fell hardest on those who had no hand in the deed. Yet they also knew that something had shifted, that the hold of the Blackwoods was broken. Some looked to Rita with questions in their eyes, but she gave no answers. She offered only her presence, her steady gaze, as if to say that the night itself would speak for her. By dawn, the house was still. The neighbors who had arrived with pistols now whispered among themselves, unease etched on their faces. The thought that power could fall so suddenly, so completely, unsettled them more than the sight of death. They wondered who might be next, whether their own tables might one day hold the same fate. They spoke of control, of punishment, of making examples, but their voices lacked conviction. They could not escape the truth that lingered in the air. The fear they had relied upon was no longer theirs alone to wield. Rita returned to her quarters as the sun rose, her body heavy, but her mind clear. She lifted the floorboard and placed the journal in her lap. She turned its pages slowly, reading the names, the dates, the cruelties recorded there. For the first time, the words felt lighter, as if some of the weight had lifted from the paper. She did not write that morning. She only sat with the silence, letting it settle into her bones. The reckoning was not only for the Blackwoods. It was for all who had lived under their shadow. The land itself seemed different in the days that followed. The fields lay quiet, the usual bark of orders absent. The house loomed still, but its windows stared out like hollow eyes. The quarters buzzed with cautious hope, though voices remained hushed. No one knew what the county would decide, how the law would strike, or whether vengeance would spill beyond the house. But they all knew something had broken that could not be mended. The storm had come and passed, leaving the world changed. The county could not look away. News of the Blackwoods' sudden fall spread faster than the river in flood. By the second morning, riders from neighboring plantations gathered at the gates, their horses restless, their faces pale with questions they could not form aloud. The richest family in the district had collapsed at their own table, struck down in the center of their home, and no one could explain how. The story twisted in every telling. Some whispered of sickness, others of a curse. A few brave ones spoke the word poison. Whatever the version, all agreed on one point. Someone within had delivered the blow. Suspicion turned quickly toward the quarters, for no one else could have prepared the meal. The sheriff arrived in a cloud of dust, flanked by armed men, his jaw set hard. He demanded answers, dragging servants into the yard, questioning them until voices cracked. He spoke of justice, but his eyes burned with fear, the fear of losing the order he depended on. Whips hung at his men's sides, a reminder that the trial would not be of fairness, but of force. Yet even under the weight of threats, the quarters remained silent. Not one tongue gave Rita's name. Rita herself did not tremble when the sheriff's eyes found her. She stood still, hands folded, gaze lowered but steady. He asked his questions, circling her with words sharp as knives. She answered with calm, her voice plain, each response careful but true enough to leave no crack. She spoke of preparing meals as she always had, of serving as she was told, of knowing nothing beyond her duty. He pressed harder, searching her face for guilt, but she gave him only silence where he wanted confession. The trial he sought would not come from her lips. Neighbors held meetings in the courthouse, their debates spilling into the square. Some called for swift punishment, for a hanging to restore fear. Others urged caution, worried that too much haste might reveal their own vulnerabilities. They spoke in circles, voices rising, tempers fraying, but no agreement settled. The Blackwoods' death had unsettled more than one household. If the mightiest could fall, what safety did the rest truly have? Their silence betrayed the truth. They were less concerned with justice than with their own reflection in the Blackwoods' ruin. The enslaved watched from shadows, their eyes sharp. They knew well how fragile this balance was, how quickly vengeance might turn upon them. Yet they also felt something shift. For once the questions were not aimed at them alone, but at the entire order of things. Rita's silence became their shield. By refusing to speak, she left the county to wrestle with its own fear. No proof, no witness, no confession. The story remained unfinished, and the uncertainty gnawed at those who relied on certainty to rule. Days stretched into weeks. The doctor issued reports filled with contradictions. One day he swore it was poison, the next he claimed fever worsened by heat. Ledger books were examined but revealed nothing new. Servants were beaten for answers they could not give. Still, no clarity came. The courthouse echoed with arguments, but no verdict ever reached the gallows. The trial remained suspended in silence, the county bound by doubt it could not shake off. Rita returned each night to her journal, writing with a hand steady as ever. She recorded the questions asked, the threats made, the names of those who cried loudest for punishment. She wrote of the hush that fell over the quarters when the sheriff's men left, of the whispered prayers that rose in the dark. Her words carried the weight of a truth the world refused to name. She did not call herself innocent, nor did she claim guilt. She simply set down what was, leaving the future to decide its meaning. In time, the furor quieted. The Blackwoods were buried under stones too heavy to honor them, their names carved into marble that tried to mask the stain of their deeds. Neighbors muttered their condolences but did not linger long at the graveside. The plantation passed into the hands of distant kin, weaker men without the iron grip of Samuel or the cruelty of Thomas. Order returned in appearance, but it was thin, a fragile shell over cracks too deep to mend. The trial that never happened became its own story. People spoke of it in lowered voices, warning their children of what silence could hide. Some insisted Rita was guilty, though no proof ever surfaced. Others claimed she was only a witness to a curse that chose its own time. In the quarters, her name was spoken with care, not as accusation but as a sign of strength. She had faced their questions and offered nothing but calm. In a world built on forced speech, her refusal to speak was its own verdict. The county learned to live with doubt, though it gnawed at them like a worm in fruit. Every supper that followed in every grand house carried a shadow. Every glass of wine, every dish of meat, was swallowed with the memory of what had happened at the Blackwood table. The silence that shielded Rita spread beyond her, seeping into every corner of their world. It was a silence heavy with truth, one they could not name yet could not escape. Time does not erase, it buries. The Blackwood plantation did not collapse in a single day, yet from the moment the brothers were laid beneath stone, its decline was certain. Fields that once rang with forced labor grew silent, crops left untended, the earth refusing to yield the same harvests under weaker hands. The overseers barked orders, but their voices carried less weight. Rumors of the curse spread, whispered from kitchen to field, until even the new masters walked their halls with unease. They could not sleep in the rooms where the brothers had died. Doors slammed in the night, shadows lengthened, and the scent of smoke seemed to linger though no fire had burned. Rita remained, outwardly unchanged, her steps as steady, her gaze as calm. Yet within she knew her time there was ending. She had planted something that could not be uprooted. The journal beneath her floorboards grew heavy with words, a record not only of cruelty but of resistance. She wrote of the trial that never was, of the silence that shielded her, of the looks in the eyes of those who feared her but could not prove why. Each page became both testimony and weapon, though she did not yet know who might wield it. The enslaved whispered her name like a prayer. Not openly, not foolishly, but with a reverence that carried into the dark. They spoke of the night the fireworks masked footsteps, of how the masters who had believed themselves untouchable were found broken. Mothers hushed their children with stories of Rita's courage, reminding them that even chains could not smother fire. Hope traveled on those whispers, fragile but alive, threading through quarters and swamps, crossing rivers, carried north by fugitives who heard the tale and repeated it in other tongues. The county never forgot, though it pretended to. Planters avoided speaking of the Blackwoods in daylight, yet over brandy their voices lowered as they asked each other what had truly happened. Some insisted it was poison, others swore it was witchcraft. A few admitted what they feared most, that one of their own servants had done it with cunning sharper than any blade. That thought lodged deep, and though they covered it with laughter, their eyes betrayed them. They watched their tables more carefully, their cups more closely, their servants with suspicion that bred its own unrest. Years slipped forward. The great houses weathered storms, markets rose and fell, wars whispered on the horizon. The Blackwood plantation decayed piece by piece, until vines curled over its porches and the grand cypress beams sagged with rot. Children dared each other to step inside the abandoned halls, claiming to hear screams in the floorboards or see shapes in the windows. Travelers passed quickly by the overgrown gates, calling it cursed ground. The land remembered what the world tried to forget. Rita's fate blurred in the telling. Some said she escaped north through the swamps, guided by her own knowledge of stars and rivers, reaching freedom in lands where her name became legend. Others claimed she remained, quiet and watchful, until death took her on her own terms, her body hidden by friends who refused to let her grave be marked by those who had once owned her. A few swore they saw her years later in Savannah markets, older, walking with dignity no chains could touch. The truth became less important than the story, for what endured was not her body but her defiance. Her silence during the trial, her calm in the face of power, her refusal to bend even when surrounded by death. These became lessons carried from mouth to ear across generations. The story of Rita was told by firelight, in hidden corners, by voices that trembled yet did not break. She became a reminder that even the most feared masters could fall, that freedom could be carved out not just with flight, but with resistance sharp and deliberate. When war finally came and the old order broke, those who had heard Rita's name carried it into new life. Freedmen taught their children to read not only from books but from memory, speaking her story alongside scripture, as proof that courage was as real as chains. The Blackwood plantation, by then nothing but ruins swallowed by vines, stood as a monument not to power, but to its undoing. Travelers who paused at its gates felt the weight of silence heavier than any sermon, and so the legacy of fire endured. Rita's act had been one night, one decision, one strike that echoed louder than cannon. The men she felled believed themselves immortal, but their graves told otherwise. The silence she kept during the trial spread wider than words, silencing even those who thought themselves masters of speech. Her memory burned not in marble or paper, but in the unshakable truth that oppression, no matter how vast, could be broken by the hand of one who refused to yield. The land still whispers when the wind moves through the cypress. Some say it is the sound of footsteps across wooden floors. Others hear the swing of an axe, the cry of men startled in their sleep. But those who know better hear a different sound, the voice of a woman who spoke not with words but with deeds, who left behind a silence heavier than all the laws of her time. Rita of Savannah, enslaved yet unbroken, turned the July 4th into her own declaration. The fire she lit has never gone out,